And, thank you for joining us, first of all. In the meantime, please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know, who you are, where you're coming from, and maybe what is one way that you enjoy being creative, whether that's for, for self-care, for advocacy, just for fun, anything like that. Let us know and we'll get started in just a couple of seconds. All right, so welcome to the first of what we hope will be many events like this, events in our AAPI Creatives series, where we are inviting those in our communities that are approaching our work, our anti-violence work, our social justice work, our equity building work, through creative mediums like, art, music, film, dance, photography, writing, cooking, tailoring, the sky's the limit, really. Gender-based violence, as we know, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It touches so many aspects of a survivor's life, of a community's lives, families' lives. And so, it leaves traces everywhere. It leaves its impacts everywhere. And so how we work to address violence and to end it shouldn't just be one directional. It should be layered. And so there's so many more ways to make an impact than, for example, being in meetings and writing emails, which sometimes is what I feel like my job is to write emails and be in meetings. So today we've invited Amanda Chen, who is, well, she's many things, and some of those include podcaster, writer, and entrepreneur. She's the host of the Miss Amanda Chen podcast. And this is a podcast, if you're not familiar, that's covered everything from self-reflection to masculinity. And thanks for the longer description in the chat, as I just admit some more folks from the waiting room. And we'll talk more about some of her work later. And for now, I just want to say welcome and thank you for joining us, Amanda.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, yeah. And maybe I should introduce myself to some of you who may not be familiar. My name is Shirley Liu, she, her pronouns. I'm with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We're a national resource center, advocacy center, providing technical assistance, training, research, and advocacy, policy advocacy included, on violence that affects Pacific Islander and Asian populations in the United States. So don't want to belabor the intro too much. For those of you who are here, I think let's just keep it casual. Let's keep it informal. It's a fairly small group. We are recording the session, but if you're comfortable with keeping your cameras on, we welcome it. If you have a question that you just want to jump in and unmute yourself and ask the question, we welcome that too. Otherwise, type your questions in the chat and hopefully we'll have time at the end to answer them. So, I have a couple of questions for Amanda and would love her to introduce herself and her work to us. Amanda, do you want to do a longer introduction maybe to yourself before we jump into your work?
Sure. So I'm Amanda Chen. I'm Taiwanese Canadian, and now I'm living in Mexico. I basically made the move to Mexico 2 years ago, mainly for an escape of the pandemic, and now it's become my full-time life here. I started my podcast over 1.5 years ago, also during the pandemic, and I'll talk more about the 100 Masked Men series, which is the main bulk of work that I've been doing for the past year. And now I am hopefully creating a non-alcoholic mezcal here in Mexico. So that's the new entrepreneurial venture that I'm slowly working on. And yeah, I'm a speaker, I'm a business coach. I do a lot of work in gender-based violence in the hospitality space. I think that is one of the most obvious environments for that type of behavior. So I'm really excited that that I get to be speaking here specifically to talk a little bit more about my unique experience. So yeah, that's a little quick blurb about me.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't think I knew about this non-alcoholic mezcal venture. I'd love to maybe talk with you more on the side about that. But
Yeah.
yeah, so let's talk about the 100 Masked Men podcast series. I'm just gonna read the very quick description of it that Amanda has on her website, just because I think it's great and it encapsulates better than I could. So it says, with nothing to lose, a loud feminist sits down to interview 100 anonymous men about masculinity, fear, and self-worth. So can you tell us maybe a little bit about the series and what listeners can learn from it?
Yeah, so I used to run a lot of feminist and women empowerment events in the city in Toronto, specifically focused around bars and restaurants. And I started to coach other women on helping them, build confidence, build their businesses. But I was hitting a wall whenever I would experience any negative experiences with men in their lives. And I realized that that's because I had a very narrow-minded perspective on negative relationships with men. So I wasn't able to help my own allies, my own peers, with this kind of negative, angry energy that I held. And with all of the bars and restaurants being closed during the pandemic, I thought this is a moment for me to check myself. And, the biggest thing for anything is seek to understand before you're being understood. And that's kind of what entertained the idea of the 100 Masked Men. If I could at least introduce 100 men from all around the world, different from my current narrow-minded concept of the men that I only see in bars, at least that might give me just a different perspective to how I view men in my life. So that was the impetus that brought me to the 100 Masked Men. And how I titled the Masked Men was, at this time, we were all questioning, should we wear masks during the pandemic for our own sake, to protect ourselves, or to protect others, or to appear like we're protecting others, or, where was the actual intention behind wearing this mask? And I thought, well, that is actually a physical mask. What about all of the invisible masks that we wear on a regular basis to either appear like we're something that we're not, or to adhere to certain rules that we may or may not agree with? And that made me question the whole concept of masculinity and the patriarchy and the things that we were trying to break down. Where did they really come from? How are they rooted in the modern men that exist in the world today? So the 100 Masked Men series began with a very ambitious decision to spend a year abroad in Mexico, where I would be interviewing 2 men a week. And that was the only consistent thing I had going for me in Mexico. I was in a different part of Mexico every week. Didn't matter, but at least I had those 2 interviews that had to happen every week. And I would either hunt people down on the beach, or I'd find a friend of a friend and Zoom in or something. So it was a very exciting time for me to just see how many people I would meet in a year and how that would change how I view myself, ultimately at the end of the day, when I create these new relationships with others.
So it's actually 100 episodes long, right?
It is, yeah.
That's amazing. It sounds like a lot of work, and kudos to you for, just being consistent with the two interviews a week. I think that I can imagine it led to a lot of kind of maybe weird and awkward conversations, maybe some uncomfortable conversations. Would now be a good time to share your little reel that kind of introduces the series. Just give me a second. Let me do a share screen, and hopefully I can get it to play.
Listening to you. I'm listening to what you're saying. I'm listening to you now. 97, 96 other guys, they weren't listening.
Doing this with you right now is like a checkpoint, or like a chapter of me accepting, 5 years ago, this would not happen.
This was a really interesting conversation, I gotta say. I wasn't expecting it to go like that.
I'm really curious, if I may ask a personal question. What's that experience been like for you, on a personal level? Because that shit sounds tough.
Because you're not anonymous. I can say whatever I want. That wasn't me. You know what I mean? You co-sign on what you say.
I do understand what you feel, and I respect you for that, because I feel like you take a lot of courage and you really have to be brave to do that.
I also kind of see you, from what I know of you so far, as someone who's trailblazing. You're taking on this new format, and who knows where it's going to.
You're right.
Come on, girl. I'm listening to you. I'm listening to what you're saying.
Hopefully you heard that, and I think I caught it where it was about to loop.
Yeah.
You can always check out Amanda's Instagram. We'll leave links to everything at the end. Yeah, so can you let us know, and we'd love to hear just some of your takeaways or your kind of like your aha moments, your learnings from doing these 100 interviews that stuck with you.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is you get what you put out, you know. The first quarter, so I organized the series with 4 quarters. Each quarter I would reveal 25 episodes. And the first quarter was basically me just yelling at guys and finding as many guys that I could yell at. And nothing was happening, right? To then the second quarter, I was just overly silent. I was too quiet. I was just like, okay, everyone just take over the mic. And I almost guilted myself into that because of how much I was yelling at the first quarter, to then finding some type of balance towards the third quarter when I was like, okay, I just need to give them some time to listen. So my strategy was to spend an hour speaking to them just generally unrecorded, and then we would record the second hour together. And that way, we've now created some trust. We've actually talked about some other things so that when we get into the interview, it would be an elaboration of those things or a repeat of those things. And people are much more able to re-elaborate on something they've already said to you before versus the first time speaking about it. They might not put in all of the details that might be relevant. And towards the fourth final quarter, it was really surprising because it went full circle where now we had men yelling at me, you know, and realizing that everyone is at a different part of the spectrum. And at the end, I felt moments where I was like, oh, this is a failure. Now I'm back at the beginning. Some people are yelling at me now. Do I yell back? Do we start all over again? But it was having this respect and this general compassion for both myself and the people I'm speaking to, that there's an ability for us to all communicate on many different forms, that we don't always have to be on the exact same page, on the exact same life stage to be able to feel like we're connected to them.
So it's like you're learning things about yourself and your journey as you're talking to these men.
Yeah.
But what a time intensive process this must have been. I'm just thinking like 100 conversations, you know, times 2 basically, because you're having the trust building conversation first and then the actual conversation. But thinking about it not having been part of this process of interviewing or doing a podcast before, that sounds like something that you don't want to skip, right? Kind of that initial trust building with anybody that you're talking to.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that kind of leads into the next question that I had, which is what it took to get these men to have these vulnerable and somewhat awkward conversations with you. Is there anything else that you can share around tips and strategies for that?
I think being very transparent and clear about the intention you have for the conversation. Ultimately, I didn't have a goal besides just having the 100 conversations. I didn't care really about the topics, if they were going to be good conversations or bad conversations. A lot of the times podcasts were focused on learning more about the person, getting some street cred. And a lot of the people that I interviewed were like, well, what do I get out of this podcast? And I said nothing, because it's anonymous and we're not even going to reveal your name. We're not going to reveal where you're from. So this is really your chance to have an open conversation about things that you might never have shared before. And that's really difficult because some men on my show, that was the first time they've ever expressed any form of vulnerability. So if that's their first time and they're doing it on a mic in a public platform, that might be great if people would rather speak in an anonymous group. But even speaking at all was really challenging, and the subject matter I was asking for was really challenging as well. But the people that I did find that were willing to just try was the greatest gift out of this experience.
You said some of them have never been in a space where they're vulnerable before. Does that just have to do with, you know, maybe to put it very simplistically, the expectations, norms that society puts on men, or is it just nobody's ever asked them these questions where they had an opportunity to say their mind, or is it, you know, something else?
I think it's both. I think that the opportunity is not there for them to speak honestly. The questions, these types of questions weren't asked. I think one that really comes to mind that I used to ask in my like kind of flash rounds at the end of the interview is, how do you like to receive love? And more often than not, a lot of the men would say, well, it's okay, I don't need to receive love. I like to give love, and the way I'm going to give love is through X and Y ways to show you that I care for you and provide for you. And I said, cool, that's fantastic. But the question was, how do you receive love? And having them rethink about it and say, wow, no one's asked me that question that specifically, and I actually don't know how to answer that. And I said, well, all love needs to go full circle. So if you're giving all this love, you can't receive it back. And to have love, to be love is in the giving of it. So if you're not allowing the other person to give it back too, then you're stopping that circuit ultimately. And that's why one of you ends up feeling like your cup is empty versus the other. And it's what's been really great to witness is these men coming out of these interviews saying, wow, you know what, I'm going to call my friends and ask them the same question to see if anyone has ever been asked this question before. So there are these moments where these like aha moments come, and they're like, wow, I never thought about love in that way. I always thought it was contingent on an action or behavior or result or an outcome that is dependent on the interaction you have with somebody else. And if that's the case, then you're leaving your self-worth in the hands of someone else to offer it back to you.
Yeah, you just said a lot. I think I have to maybe sit a little with what you said to fully respond, because it made me think, you know, how do I, you know, it makes you think about how do you talk to the men and the male identified folks in your life. And I don't think I've ever asked that question, or even occurred to me to ask the question. So you've given me something to think about. Here's another hard question. So, you know, a lot of our audience comes from the domestic violence or sexual assault field. They work with men in prevention, challenging harmful masculinity, challenging gender norms. Some folks in our audience may have worked with men who have done harm, and are working towards a healing journey or a healing process. So from your conversations with men of, you know, all different types, not just harm doers, is there any advice that you can offer to these people in our audience who may be doing this work?
Yeah, I think there is a need for us to be able to name how to name what the punishments and consequences are for certain actions. On top of that, name what those resolutions could be. What are the actions to get redemption afterwards? Because if there is no real redemption where you can come back to society and be reaccepted for who you are after all of the work that you've done, if there's none of that, then there's no point to even go through that journey. So I've spoken to some men that are just like, I'm just going to cancel myself before other people cancel me, because I know I've done something wrong. And when I do this, then at least hopefully I'll get the forgiveness, the like, let me ask for forgiveness after tactic. And what I learned from that is there is this feeling of needing an audience to give you integrity or accountability or responsibility for your actions, rather than you just doing it yourself. You needed an audience to either say yes or no, that this was enough of a punishment or a consequence for you. And that can be financially. You have to, you know, pay back to this person, this community, do some time, don't work, whatever these potential punishments and consequences are. And then I meet the other side of others that might have gone through more extreme consequences, and their entire lives are changed. Like all of their friends and family now look at them differently, and there's no way that they can re-enter society. And those ones actually have more of a desire for change, because ultimately they're starting from scratch again. They've already lost everything, and when you have lost everything, there's nothing left to lose, and it's actually easier for you to continue. And also, it was taken away from you, right? There wasn't like, oh, let me just renounce myself and then hand over all of this power. And like, that's not even a real context. So once I heard those stories, I realized, wow, like we don't have an example or a roadmap to bringing people back into the society, right? And if we don't know how to name that and explain that, then we can't start anywhere until that exists. So I think as we're having this conversation, and that roadmap could be different per person and experience and what the situation is, but at least creating one where it's like, okay, if you were going to check off these 5 things in the next 24 months, then yes, you're reaccepted, and this is what that looks like. And can we truly forgive someone for these actions and move on from that? I think that's that requires a lot of practice.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, I think if we're all for the overall healing of families, of communities, and just of society as a whole, then we need to think about ways that we can, like you said, bring harm doers back into the fold. And if we recognize that domestic violence and sexual assault isn't a personal issue, it's a societal issue. It comes from culture, it comes from norms, it comes from media, just all these different places, then we have to accept that, it's not just up to the person who's doing harm to be canceled forever and basically just never be accepted back. And then also I've, been in conversations where we're really kind of talking about, because we say survivor and then we say abuser, but sometimes it's not just survivor or abuser. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's one and then the other and then the first one again. It's not so what's the word I'm looking for? It's not such a dichotomy, black and white. So these are all just interesting things to explore. Have you, in the interviews, did you also speak to any men who are survivors of violence and, talked with them about how that's kind of affected their self-image as a male survivor of violence?
100%. Yeah, I was on a mission to find other men that have experienced things that are typically only experienced, at least written about in the media, by women, right? So, trafficking or, sexual assault and in specific ways. So when I seek these people out, the number one thing was like their experience didn't exist, right? Because they were a male. Even more so if they were an Asian male, this doesn't exist, doesn't matter, because literally you're at the bottom of the sex power totem pole is what they would say it for me. And just to be invisible is probably worse than being ignored, because at least if you were ignored, they kind of acknowledged you and said that you don't count, versus like just completely invisible. No one was going to ask you questions, and you're just completely discounted from the equation and they're just going to look the other way. To experience that and to understand that, because I can hear a lot of women that say, oh, I've said this thing and they just didn't believe me that much. At least it was still heard, it was still acknowledged, but it just didn't go as far based on just a multitude of societal ways. But to hear that some men, especially Asian men, just don't get a chance, and then because of that don't even bother. And when that happens, their whole life has a cloud over them of like, this is just the way that my life has to be like, just being invisible.
Yeah, that's a good point about kind of the intersectionality and the overlapping identities that we've spent a lot of time kind of, working and trying to figure out best ways to address is, there's the kind of the gendered aspect, and then there's the race aspect, and there's not a lot of people who talk about both. Often it's either one or the other, or people who hold both identities have to kind of choose one in coming into certain spaces or prioritize one over the other. So that's something that we've seen a lot too.
I think what's interesting is like specifically the male Asian person and the female Asian person, and the sex totem pole of what that looks like, because Asian women are fetishized and Asian men are just at the bottom in terms of sexual attraction. And at the same time, Asian men have the most potential to grow in business and career paths, and yet are always at the bottom. And sometimes, I think only after conducting these interviews did I realize some of the privilege I had as an Asian woman, because before I just thought like, I'm only thinking purely in the gender space of women, and I didn't think of what it would look like to just be straight up invisible and like not have any sexual power, even though my sexual power and this fetishization is not actually real. It still feels like a power that can embody me with some level of confidence. So to have that removed and to be walking with zero confidence and just to be completely invisible is an experience that I just never thought or imagined about or considered.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that I hadn't really considered in that way before. Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like the interviews are about kind of like men's experience in masculinity, but it's also kind of teaching you about women, Asian women, feminism, all of the above, right?
Yeah.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about your experience in kind of being a social justice advocate and doing this work that we're all doing from a more creative, angle. And, like I said, there's so many ways to contribute to this fight. So what's it been like for you as a writer, a brand consultant, a podcaster, creator of a non-alcoholic mezcal, to be a part of these movements?
Yeah, not everyone's going to want to play with you, right? Especially if you see the opportunity and you want to play with them, right? It doesn't work all the time, I think. And also when you're in this space, everyone is experiencing or has experienced some level of trauma. So being very trauma informed is essential in your interactions with people. I remember the first time I tried to work in gender-based violence, I was like, hey, let me throw a fundraising party for you and give you money. Let me just knock at your door and give you money. And they were just like, who are you? And I didn't understand where the hostility was coming from. I just thought like, oh, I want to support this cause. It matters to me because I come from a, empowerment angle, from a business side. And then once I started working in hospitality, that's when I experienced firsthand the violence that I would get just by simply being a woman versus my colleague that wasn't. And that's when I understood like, oh, there needs to be this confrontational element, this level of self-protection. But now that I'm in a space where I'm my own entrepreneur, I get to decide how I present myself in society. I'm realizing that was also a mask that I wore in seemingly overconfident and super protective and defensive. You don't need all of that armor anymore to be able to have these conversations, to be able to participate in this movement. What you can do is embody a lifestyle where you no longer carry yourself in fear, and that you just genuinely feel protected and believe in that and embody that, rather than carrying around all the armor and all of the protective measures to make sure that you're secure. And then, getting other people to think that they have to have the same things too. I think that was my biggest mistake originally in thinking that everyone needed armor, everyone needed to take self-defense classes, everyone needed to strengthen themselves and be like men, essentially, to fight other men, instead of, actually, how can we do this in our own way, remaining authentic to ourselves and just believing that we can be productive.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you mentioned maybe some kind of stumbling blocks that you had as like a woman in the hospitality space and, having these conversations. Can I ask if you had any similar experiences as a Asian or Taiwanese Canadian person? A lot of our audience is from the US, I believe, not Canada, but I imagine some of the experiences are similar.
Yeah, absolutely. I was working at a Latin club, So that was already, you know, adding in a bunch of layers of different ethnicities. And yeah, I remember I didn't know what violence was until I was at this bar where maybe I couldn't hear them. Maybe I was late at responding because I couldn't hear what they were saying. Things were loud. I was also new staff, to the point that I would just get pushed or touched inappropriately, and there was no there's nothing that anyone could do about it, and or no one decided to do anything about it. And that's when I realized, like, wow, I'm really left alone in this space. There's no protective measures, no check-ins, no one shares this stuff. And if you can't handle it, you just leave. You know, I remember the first time that a customer just kissed me when I was trying to give him the bill, and my first response was just to freeze. I just froze. I couldn't operate for the next 10 minutes, and then I was sent home instead of any other method. So what was wild also was they decided to put me at the front of the room to be the first person to come in, because they obviously wanted a woman at the front of the room, but then I would be susceptible to every single type of physical interaction possible. And, you know, slowly I was able to accommodate that, but I don't think that was the best approach in terms of just like collecting the multiple ways of behaving around this, or just becoming like very cold and, you know, aggressive. I didn't have the tools set up for myself. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is like not knowing what tools you even need to get before you arrive.
And it's like, you didn't have the tools, right? It's not, you were never given the tools, and you were expected that to get them yourself, right? It wasn't provided, or like the support wasn't there to recognize that this stuff happens, and to give people what they need to kind of cope or manage or, you know, heal. I think that's something that's lacking in not just the hospitality industry, and, you know, many industries across the board, unfortunately, and as no surprise to anybody here, I don't think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. So my next question, so we talked about the 100 Men, 100 Masked Men series, but it's not the only thing you've done. You've done so much more, as we've alluded to. You have the podcast. So your podcast has so much more than just the 100 Men, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but the 100 Men is a series within your broader podcast called the Miss Amanda Chen Show. And that's now on season 5. That podcast describes Amanda as an ex-journalist turned retired entrepreneur turned motivational coach and speaker, currently an expert in curiosity, living in Mexico. So can you tell us about kind of your personal journey, what that's been like for you to wear so many hats?
Yeah, I'm now in season 5. The first 4 seasons were the 4 quarters of the 100 Masked Men, and this one is all about learning how to live. I realized how much I didn't know what living with aliveness meant. A lot of the way I interacted with life was to avoid negative situations or bad situations that I would label as good or bad, or be super organized so that I would never be in a situation where I didn't know what I was doing. Whereas when I was living in Mexico with absolutely no agenda, I had no idea where I was going to be next week, and I had to learn how to be okay with that type of uncertainty. So I think now that I'm in this series, I've never felt more alive, and how much I enjoy being alive. Every day I'm awake, and I'm here to experience life in all versions of it without labeling anything as a good experience, a bad experience, a shameful one, or a guilty one, and letting that day pass, accepting it for the way that it is, and then moving on to the next one. So I think, yeah, this is definitely a new chapter in having a more holistic mindset towards how I navigate through life.
So I think that brings me to a super important question, and one of my last questions, which is about, you know, I'm glad that your current season is about kind of like self-reflection and diving into your own personal journey and your own personal growth. And I think that that's something that is neglected for a lot of folks just in general, in society in general, but especially in this, our anti-violence movement. There's so many advocates who've experienced burnout. There's so many advocates who are experiencing kind of like trauma, secondary trauma from the work that they're doing. And there's many great people that have left this movement because of that. You know, they couldn't stay, it was too much, or they moved on to something new. And our movement is, you know, we can't afford to lose these amazing advocates. But sometimes, as we know, the passion, the drive is not enough on their own. I've had a lot of conversations with advocates, especially BIPOC advocates or queer and trans identified ones who have consistently struggled to find their identity in a place that they belong in this wider movement. You know, find a place to be able to hold all of the identities and, you know, bring them authentically into spaces. It seems like because your most recent season is about grounding, it's about self-reflection. Can you tell us maybe about that, or if you have any insight for us who may be experiencing burnout?
Yeah, burnout is real, because I think we are so passionate for change and we want to live in a world that's different, that every day is in a hurry, and there are just so many things that need to be done. At the end of the day, interviewing 100 men over a year, it wasn't enough. I was barely scratching the surface on what masculinity meant, but that doesn't mean that these 100 conversations got to nowhere. I was able to practice having conversations 100 times, which is more than the 0 times I had before. So it's kind of giving yourself that compassion, that instead of the external reward or acknowledgement of someone else acknowledging like, oh, you've done a good job, oh, you've made the significant change, you've moved the law this way, you've saved this many lives. It's like, you've saved your life in this one way of even just attempting to live your life differently. So your world has already changed. It doesn't need to be changed in this like massive dramatic way that you idealize in your head. Like, that will happen, but probably after your lifetime. So once you realize that the way that you're going, the fun of it, or the purpose of it is really within that journey, and the learnings that you'll have through each day is what really brings the movement, because you embody that in your journey rather than the results of that journey.
Yeah, I mean, nobody has more time in their lives to do another thing, but I think even so, it's really important just to kind of stop and think about, you know, why you're here, why you're in this movement, like what it means for you. And when I say you, I guess I'm speaking about myself and maybe some of my fellows who might feel the same way. You know, think about why we're here, not just plod on endlessly. Sometimes it feels like we're just hitting brick walls over and over again. I know in this particular movement, sometimes they can feel like that. But just to be grounded in purpose, I guess. Is that kind of what you're doing with this season?
Yeah, and you're always going to question even why you're doing it. So for example, with the non-alcoholic mezcal, like I wanted to find another avenue where I could still be in this industry, but drinking and drinking culture wasn't working or serving me the way that it used to. I didn't like who I was at that time. So in introducing that, I realized, okay, well, even if I'm doing a non-alcoholic experience, I'm still working with people in the alcohol industry. I don't have to be here. I could leave. I could work in another space where I don't have to experience this, but now I'm here and I'm more prepared to do it. I'm not coming in with the attitude of I have to be the one, I have to be the only woman entrepreneur that's going against all of them masculine mezcal people here. Like, it's not a fight. I'm not here to be the only one, to be the one representation, to be the exempt, the one exception. I used to take that attitude. And when you have that attitude, you're going to burn out, because there's no way you can be this magical superhero that's like the only one that's going to succeed in this thing against all measures, right? That's like a ridiculous level of stress and commitment and responsibility. But when you think of it as like, I'm just going to be one of them so that others can join me in this movement, and they're going to do it in their unique way. All of us are different. We're not competing. It's all together. So once you think of it that way, it's more like, oh, I'm just like on one side of this road, and I'm going to meet other people on the other sides of the road, but we're all on the same road. I don't have to pave my own path and go solo and super hard the way that I used to think I had to do.
Yeah, I love that. And, we're lucky to be in a movement with so many amazing people, men and women, all approaching it from kind of a different space with their own experiences. I've met so many amazing advocates, writers, storytellers in doing this work. And that's a great reminder that sometimes you can kind of lean on the work of others who've come before, and sometimes you just leave it to the people who come after, and hopefully they clean up whatever mess that you left behind.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think maybe one last question is, if we have anybody in the audience who is, maybe thinking about doing something, like art or poetry or something, getting into the creative space, what advice would you have for them?
If you have the desire to, just start. It's going to start ugly. It's going to not make any sense, but you're going to be better for it, because the longer you spend thinking about it, the more ideas you're going to come up with, and all of these ideas are going to add up to ideas you've never done. Whereas if you just started, at least you start off with that really bad, ugly idea, and then it would transform and be improved as you continue going with it. It's really just taking that first step, and only you can come up with that idea. Like any other person that you might have seen that exists today, they're going to do it with their perspective and their ideas and their unique contribution. So the world needs you to be your authentic self. So rather than, holding it to yourself and thinking, oh my God, this idea sucks, or I don't know if it's going to come out, like, let it exist in the world. And maybe that would inspire one other human that's like, oh, you know what, that actually makes me think of something else. And then that one idea can spread to other ideas, right? So sometimes I think of it as like, if that idea exists, it's there for you as a gift for you to give to the world. Otherwise, you're kind of being selfish with it. So might as well let it spread.
Yeah, I love that. And hopefully we've inspired somebody to let their idea exist in the world also. And I have to think about what ways I can be creative. I'm not a very creative artsy person, but maybe there's something I can contribute to from that area. I don't think I have any additional questions for you. Of course, all of what we talked about can be the subject of, many long conversations. But I want to make sure we give time for anybody who's here. If they have any questions for you, drop them in the chat. Let us know, or, just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask them. In the meantime, Amanda, maybe do you want to share how folks can keep up with your work, or find you, or, just the different ways to be in touch with you?
Yeah, so my podcast is the Miss Amanda Chen Show podcast. You can find that on all streaming platforms. My website is also missamandachen.com, or you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Miss Amanda Chen.
Let me just type that in. I think they got it, but let me just type that in.
Yeah, sure.
Miss Amanda Chen. Basically everywhere, right? Instagram, website. I'll just drop maybe your website, and then I think everything links. It's a beautiful website, by the way. So I encourage everybody to, go and visit. A lot of great photos. It makes me feel, well, looking at some of your recent podcast photos, it makes me feel like I want to be in Mexico too, and just kind of relaxing and doing some inward gazing.
Yeah. It's oh, sorry.
Say that again?
Oh, I was going to say, it's interesting. I spent the last the summer back home in Toronto, just to be back with family. And when I was last in Mexico, it was very free will, didn't know what I was going to do next. And then now I'm back here with a lot more purpose. So it's always like a yin and yang movement of like, you know, sometimes you're just hanging out in Mexico and living your life, and then now you're coming in with more drive. And it's always a balancing act. It's never like, oh, I dropped the ball on this and now I'm doing this, or I need this time to heal and that's why I'm doing this. It's really just always a balancing act that sometimes we might not look at it in that perspective, for both, you know, having the creative juice to go on, both with like burnout. I believe I was very much in a doing mindset with 100 Masked Men, and like forcing myself to go and interview people every 2 people a week. But that was the saving grace for me. Like that was the only thing that was consistent, and I needed some type of grounding. So if you're thinking like my creative activity needs to be something grounding, or at least like I'm moving towards a common goal, whatever that goal is, as long as it's a goal that makes sense for you, not a goal that's like external, that is like, oh, I want to be recognized for this piece of work, or like it won't be successful unless it's recognized, versus like, I just want to do it for the sake of doing it because my life is going to be enriched. And that's it.
Was there ever a moment where you're like, I don't want to do it anymore? I'm sick of talking to these men and hearing their voices. Did that ever happen, or was it always just kind of interesting to hear and to learn from them?
Oh yeah, there was so many times that I was like, this is stupid. I want to quit. Why am I sitting here listening to men? I was gaining more male followers and listeners, obviously, but then I was losing a lot of female followers and listeners. And I was constantly debating on whether or not I was a bad feminist for giving the platform to men. But if we don't do that, then how can we expect these men to be our allies if we don't give them the space to show up in the way that they want to show up, instead of like saying, oh, you got to show up like a woman? Like, how's that going to work? And how does that help anyone? When actually we want them to show up as the men that they are, because the men are the ones that have the power to enforce more change, and get us to a better gender equality. So it was kind of counterintuitive to be like, oh, show up as these men, but show up in a way that women show up as, and none of it makes any sense. So it was really just a checkpoint for everyone to say, like, how are we doing this? Why isn't it working? Can we make this better? And a lot of that comes internally from yourself, because you might be the one blocking that pathway to some kind of revolution or some kind of better balance in navigating through the space.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean, feminism isn't just a woman's issue. Gender violence isn't just a woman's issue. If we want men to be part of the solution or solutions, we need to be thinking about ways that they can give their, insight, input, that we can work together with them, with everybody, around these issues. I think that's the only way that we can make any real, meaningful, lasting difference in prevention. And I know there's a lot of people who, in our networks, who would agree and are doing that, are doing the engaging men and doing support groups and things like that for men. So, I just want to thank you for coming on and being the first in our creative series, and for sharing your work with us. I want to pause maybe another minute in case there's any questions. I don't want to cut anybody off, but I'm not seeing any outstanding ones today. Outstanding questions, I mean.
Okay.
Not outstanding like amazing, but like they're leftover unaddressed questions. Yeah. If you do have any, feel free to get in touch with Amanda via her website, or myself. I can drop my email, gbv.org. I hope you'll join me in sharing appreciations with her. And if you know anybody who is a API creative who would be interested in coming in this space and sharing, put them in contact with me, or have them email me, send them to me. I'd love to hear about them. We have a couple of other great ones down the pike. We'll be sharing more info about them once the date gets closer. some appreciations for you in the chat, Amanda, and from me also.
May I ask a question?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you for the discussion. And I was just wondering, like at the end, about men having voices. So how do we reconcile that in our society, it is men's voices? It's men's voices in government. It's men's voices in companies. And how do we reconcile that they do have a role? Most, I don't know the numbers, but governors, legislatures, most of them are men. So they do have a place, right? So how do we reconcile bringing them to the table when they're kind of running the table in our society?
So a lot of the times they don't know that they're running the table. They just, like, they literally believe that they're doing this for all of the people, right? They don't actually see their own power, but they know when you're trying to take away their power. They just don't know how much they have. They don't know, you know, where they stand with it, right? And they're also using their voice for specific topics and subjects, right? So when you actually ask them about showing up as they are or showing up of how they feel, rather than talking about movement or change or, you know, anything that's societal, suddenly the conversation changes. They have actually no idea how do they feel. We can't even get them to explain feelings without physical descriptors, right? Like, oh, I feel like I have a crank in my neck, or I feel like something else. It's a physical concept of what feeling is versus an internal one that women might just have conversationally more experience with. So by giving them the space, it's about the space in that topic, in that environment, and that conversation. And when you're able to create safety there, it will allow safety for them to speak on your behalf on the spaces that they can. But until then, they don't feel safe. They think that, you know, women are out here to attack them, or everyone's out here to attack the power that they perceive, apparently have, that they don't perceive themselves. They're just like, everyone wants to attack my invisible power that I don't feel like I'm very powerful doing because I live my life this way, right? So once you understand that and you say like, oh, wow, I can see your power. It's so blatantly obvious and loud over here, but if they don't live it, they don't see it, then no one is getting anywhere. And unfortunately, the conversation kind of, I think, but needs to begin with women, because we have this experience and allowance to speak more emotionally, more openly, more with fluidity. And when that acceptance and compassion exists with these men, hopefully they'll be able to feel confident supporting us in what they can and know how to do. But even after that, like, we need to direct them, right? To say like, okay, well, now that you understand everything else and we understand you, how can we work together? And then that's when we can get strategic and actually tactical and make real change that would happen on a societal level. But it starts from relationships first.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Great question.
Yeah, great question, and very difficult question also. I think sometimes men's voices are too loud in certain spaces, like you mentioned. But we want to invite them into other spaces where they can help make a difference. Any other questions? Some more thanks and appreciation in the chat.
Awesome.
Yeah, I have a question. My name is Ray. Thanks, Amanda, for your work and for sharing today, and Shirley for facilitating and leading this. And as somebody who's socialized and who lives and identifies as male, particularly an Asian male, this is fascinating for me. And it is also, reinforces and affirms the many parts of masculinity that I am challenged by, that it's ultimately really sad. And so part of the challenge, I think, is we just don't talk about this ever. Men don't, women don't. There's all kinds of other narratives that are dominant. And it's all the narratives that we're bringing up here, including that men know they're in power, women know that men are in power, and few folks really are having dialogue about what it all means. And there is, of course, a lot of things that seem to yeah, divide folks, because, you know, I am somebody who is really doing my best to take down patriarchy, and I contribute to it every dang day that I exist, and in my work life and in my home life. And so just thanks for this conversation. I know there's not much more time here. I would love further conversation, and for all of us, myself included, who have been part of anti-violence efforts, whether it's gender-based violence or otherwise, there are just so few men at the table. And I think that there are a whole lot more men who want to be at the table, but it is not a place that is as, I won't say as welcome, but that is just as normalized as it needs to be. So my call out to everybody, myself included, is that we normalize this kind of space more often. And that I am not one of the few folks who, at least by name here and by shared pronouns, is in a space, you know, we just need to have more men at the conversation table. So thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Shirley. Appreciate the space.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, for sharing. Yeah, and agreed, definitely on all fronts, definitely. Any last thoughts or appreciations? I don't think any, so I'll just close out. Thank you for sharing your work with us, Amanda, and all the nuances and challenges and kind of difficulties of what you've done. And thank you, Suzanne and Ray, for you know, asking the questions and kind of contributing your perspective. Also, very, very great to hear that a lot of us are, you know, kind of on the same page and struggling, sitting with the same struggles and the same, yeah, I mean, it's difficult, it's a challenge, but hopefully we're helping to kind of make some forward progress as much as we can. Yeah, burnout too, right? There's so many different places that we could go with this conversation, but I'll put an end on it today. Amanda, is there any last words that you had before we close out?
I mean, I'm just grateful for having this conversation again. Like, I didn't know what was going to happen. After the project, you know, all I wanted was just to open the conversation, and I didn't expect that all of these other spaces would come out of it, and that we would even find each other, you know, through the World Wide Web. So I think sometimes you might feel like we're the only ones in the space, but there's always going to be someone else, maybe on the other side of the world, you know, that is doing the work too, and they probably feel just the same way. Like, we don't get that chance, but we do have the ability to find them, right? So it's just keeping that space open for those people to come and find you. You don't have to do all of the seeking and finding on your own. So like, they'll come to you.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Let's keep the space open and look forward to having more conversations in the future.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, and join us, you know, keep in touch with us and Amanda for future events. Take care, everyone.
Awesome. Bye.